In our final unit of the semester, we're going to be talking primarily about animals and some of the characteristics of animals and the evolutionary path that they've taken. And we're also going to talk very briefly about fungus, which bears some close relationship to animals as well. So I want to remind you of something that we talked about earlier this semester, single-celled creatures that are eukaryotic that we call protozoans, and that means the first animals. Proto means first, and zoa, kind of think of a zoo, means animal. So these are unicellular creatures. They're eukaryotic, and many of them bear quite a bit of similarity to the way that animals live their lives. They are heterotrophic. Remember, that means that they have to get their nutrients from some previously living source, like a plant or animal, and that's in uh, exactly the opposite of plants and algae that are autotrophic, meaning they can get carbon from the atmosphere. These protozoans are usually motile, so we saw some of these in lab um, earlier this semester. We saw ciliated creatures like this paramecium. You've got little cilia all over the place, so they can swim around almost like oars rowing a boat. Or these amoeba-like creatures, or these flagellated creatures that have a flagellum. So these are protozoal creatures, and we think that they are fairly closely related in evolutionary history to animals. It turns out that there are also some protist-like creatures, or protozoa-like creatures that are fairly closely related to fungus. And we call these slime molds and water molds. So the reason that I'm telling you this is what's important to think about here is these single-celled creatures, these protists, protozoa, or in this case these slime molds and water molds, seem to be the most closely related recent common ancestors to animals and to fungus. And you can also think about in our last unit talking about algae, which are single-celled protist creatures. They are the closest related creatures to land plants. So these protozoal creatures and protists that are eukaryotic single-celled creatures are most likely the common ancestors to the multicellular eukaryotes, animals, fungi, and plants. Here are some of these slime mold creatures. You can usually find them. You actually find them quite a bit if you're walking through the woods. You can see them crawling across uh, rotting logs. You actually can't see them crawling because they move so slowly. They slowly move about like bunches of goo, but they're actually protozoal creatures. So let's talk about fungus and talk about how I want you to think about and know for tests, how are they similar to plants, how are they similar to animals, and then how are they ultimately unique from those two creatures as well. Table 18.1 in your book gives a nice review of this. So fungi are definitely not plants. They're not photosynthetic. They don't have chloroplasts. They're also not animals. They probably share more in common with animals in the way that they live than they do with plants. They're heterotrophs, so they can't do photosynthesis. Um, but where they're different is that animals ingest their food. They pull it into their body or into their cells, whereas fungi actually have to grow into it and actually digest it outside of their body and absorb the digested nutrients into their body. Also, most animals are motile, meaning they can move around, and fungi are not, so they're more like plants in that way. Fungal life cycle, often there's reproduction by spores. That sounds a lot like a plant. We talked about plants that reproduce by windblown spores. But in evolutionary history, fungi are most closely related to animals, or more closely related to animals than they are to plants. This is an important slide for you to take a look at because it talks about the general body of a fungus. So when you look under a microscope at a big patch of mold like we see on the strawberry, what you'd see is millions of these branches. They're single cell thick branches called hyphae. Hyphae is the plural form. If you're talking about one of them, it's called the hypha. You just drop the E at the end. So these hyphae exist in a big mass. That's what gives a lot of molds this fuzzy look. We call that whole mass of hyphae a mycelium. So you can think of the body of a mycelium, or the body of a fungus is called a mycelium. Each individual part is a hypha. Kind of like we have a body, and then we have individual parts like arms and legs. The individual parts of this mycelium are each hypha. The way that this is put together with all of these thread-like branches gives fungus a huge surface area, which is really critical when you consider that they digest their food outside of their body, so they are very reliant on having enough surface area to absorb a lot of nutrients. I'm showing you these slides with some diagrams of the life cycle of bread molds. I don't want you to try to memorize this, and I don't want you to try to memorize the pattern of sexual and asexual reproduction within fungus, because it's pretty complicated and it's unique in lots of different types of fungus. But I do want you to think about how this exists in something like a piece of bread. I think probably all of us have found a piece of bread or other food in our household that's covered in mold. And what is growing in our food inside of it are huge masses of hyphae. So that's where the mycelium is. And then popping up whenever the creature's healthy enough to reproduce, popping up are these sporangia that blow spores all over the place. If you have allergies, you're probably quite familiar with these fungal spores, because they, for many people, cause quite a bit of misery and allergy suffering. If you're walking along and you see growing out of the ground a mushroom, that mushroom is, of course, part of a fungus. It's the part that we're most aware of, and oftentimes we think of it as the whole fungus. But actually, the mushroom is just a very small part of a much larger mass that we don't see. So underground, where we see all these hyphae, that's where the major mass of a fungus is. The mushroom is a temporary reproductive structure. So when the creature's healthy enough, usually it's gone through a sexual reproduction phase, it grows a mushroom out, and then underneath that cap are a whole bunch of sporangia producing spores to reproduce. But that is a very small part of the life cycle of a fungus, and actually a very small part of the body. Fungi play a very important role in our environment because they are decomposers. We call most fungus saprotrophs, meaning that they eat things that are already dead, so they're not actively predatory for the most part. So they are breaking down dead material, returning nutrients back to the larger nutrient pool for other creatures. Especially for plants. So fungus play an extraordinarily important role in the soil. And there are a few examples that we can find of parasitic fungus that actually are eating living things, like this oyster fungus example that can colonize some roundworms and actually slowly digest them alive. So pretty disgusting. Most fungus are not that nasty though. Fungus play some really important roles in sharing with other creatures. So what we're seeing here is a mutualistic relationship that we call a lichen. You've seen these, I'm sure, like crusty coverings on rocks and dead trees. That lichen is actually a mutualistic partnership between fungus and algae. So this little cartoon shows us what this looks like. Most of the mass of these lichens are hyphae in a mycelial body. But then inside, some of these hyphae actually are holding algae. They're almost like algae farmers, I kind of think of them. And the algae are doing photosynthesis and handing nutrients over to the fungus. In return, the algae get water, they get protection. and other nutrients. So it's a great example of a mutualistic relationship, in that case between fungus and algae. We saw this earlier in our plant unit. Here's a great example of a mutualistic relationship between fungus and a plant. So surrounding the roots of most plants are a whole lot of hyphae that are increasing the surface area for water and nutrient absorption for the plant. And the plant returns the favor to the fungus by providing sugar. So we call this a mycorrhizae. Fungus produce a whole bunch of products that we enjoy as humans. Like, for example, if you like baked goods that rise, like bread, or alcoholic beverages, or cheese, the fermentation in some cheese is made possible by fungus. Yeast is a common example of a fungus that's used in cooking. Also, most of our antibiotics are produced by either soil-borne fungus or soil-borne bacteria. Penicillin, the first antibiotic ever discovered, is actually a molecule that's secreted by a mold called penicillium. Unfortunately, that some funguses do cause harm, and economically, and to our food production process, there are quite a few different species of fungi that cause diseases that in some cases greatly decrease our crop production. And in some cases, there are even diseases that we call mycoses that affect animals and humans. Here we see the white nose syndrome in bats, which is a fungal disease that's wiping out bats left and right, unfortunately. Um, and we can even find human examples of fungal diseases. Many fungal species cannot infect a healthy person, but we do see a lot of patients with immunocompromised states, like patients with AIDS, struggling and actually quite often dying of fungal infections. For a healthy person, most fungal diseases are actually pretty minor, like the irritating and sometimes painful infections of ringworm or athlete's foot, uh, yeast infections in the vagina or in the mouth, which is often called thrush. Those are generally not extraordinarily dangerous infections, but they are caused by fungal species.